Hello, my name is Gordon Evans, and my paper was titled On Diversity in the Dharma, Exploring Alternative Expressions of Sexuality in Buddhism and Hinduism. Introduction. So my thesis statement was, through a comprehensive examination of Buddhist and Hindu scriptures, philosophical teachings, cultural realities, and lived experiences, this paper aims to explore how each tradition approaches the sensitive issue of non-traditional sexuality, with particular attention paid to the issue of male homosexuality. This examination will reveal nuanced differences in historical frameworks and social attitudes. Ultimately, through careful examination of these two traditions, light will be shed on the complexities of the evolving discourse surrounding sexual diversity within these two traditions and religious contexts more generally. Now, some of you may have noticed that there is an ellipsis in that quote, and that is because I left some stuff out, because it was quite long. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss is what some of those nuanced differences are. Ultimately, Buddhism and Hinduism both have their genesis in northern India, right? They ultimately were founded and evolved and grew. Buddhism actually broke off from Hinduism. Originally, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was a Hindu, but decided that he wasn't happy with Hindu asceticism and whatnot, and that there must be a different way, and then he founded Buddhism. He gathered some followers and whatnot. It's a conversation for a different time, but basically, over time, Hinduism has kind of almost evolved into an ethnic religion. There are many opinions on this subject, but a lot of people believe, for example, that it's impossible for one to convert to Hinduism since it's an Indian religion by its nature, whereas Buddhism expanded outside of India into China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and whatnot, and more recently into the West. However, this has kind of given it some very interesting attributes in terms of its tolerance for sexuality. Buddhism doesn't necessarily have a firm prohibition in its scripture or in its teachings on homosexuality, or anything really for that matter. Everything is kind of, every action, good or bad, generates karma, either positive or negative, but it's not necessarily a sin per se, right? Like the way we think of it in traditional Christianity or in Western society. So ultimately, Buddhism has kind of expanded, and it really, if you want to know if a particular Buddhist, for example, will find issue with homosexuality, you would really need to look deeper than just their religious belief and have to look more at the culture that they come from. For example, if someone comes from Thailand or Laos or another really kind of conservative culture, they may tend to be not as accepting of homosexuality, whereas if you have a Buddhist who comes from the United States or other places like that, they tend to be more progressive. Now, Hinduism, on the other hand, from its very beginning, was very pro-homosexuality. There's a lot of discussion in early Hindu scriptures and whatnot, discourses where homosexuality is made out to be natural, pleasurable, enjoyable. Some deities were bisexual, or as we will see, the product of a same-sex union. But over time, Indian society as a whole has become more conservative. And this is largely due, I believe, to British colonialism, which the British ruled India for quite a long time and imposed a lot of their Victorian-era, prudish, Christian kind of beliefs onto the Indian people. So that's ultimately the ultimate finding of the paper, but also what I continue to talk about in the thesis statement. So these are some historical perspectives on homosexuality in these two religious traditions. This deity is Agni, the god of fire. I wanted to use pictures because it would allow me to speak a little bit more instead of just reading text on the screen. But this is a deity, Agni. He is a very old Hindu deity. He's the god of fire and was one of the very first deities really identified in the early Hindu scriptures, such as the Rig Veda and whatnot. This was called the Vedic period. This is quite a long time ago. And interestingly, Agni is considered to be the product of a lesbian union, right? He has two mothers. Some accounts say that he has three. But this is just one example that there are several deities like this, as well as Lord Krishna, which some people may be familiar with from Hare Krishna and whatnot. There's a lot of homoerotic undertones to some of the interactions that he had with one of his followers in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, and whatnot. So there was a lot of homosexual, or at least homoerotic kind of ideas floating around in the early times of the Hindu religion. Now, in regards to Buddhism, we see that the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and his closest follower, Ananda, there's quite a bit of recent scholarly interest in the relationship that they had. Some people see a lot of homoerotic undertones as well, and just a lot of sexual tension between the two of them. With the Buddha, being described, in regards to his physical appearance, his beauty. He has the genitals of a bull and all these other things and a perfect physique. If there was not if the homoerotic undertones were not intentional, then the person who wrote them was at least quite interested in his physique for sure. So the relationship between them is of scholarly interest, and they are considered to be kind of the perfect example of this, of what we would think of nowadays as probably a gay couple. Now, in regards to scripture, it kind of gets interesting here because there's a couple of scriptures in Hinduism where this topic is addressed. One of them that I think we're all familiar with is the Kama Sutra. I don't have any images of the Kama Sutra because every time I tried to Google an image, it came up with things that were very not safe for work. So I'm not going to post anything here, but I think we get the idea. And this gentleman that we see here was composing the Laws of Manu, or the Manusmriti, which was basically a Hindu law, set of laws similar to the Code of Hammurabi, which was given out so that Hindu society could be governed under a set of laws and whatnot. It does address homosexuality, but interestingly, it addresses other things as well. Homosexuality is prohibited, as is other non-traditional forms of sexuality, such as having sex in an ox cart. So, whether or not this is actually a serious prohibition, or this was just more of a general concept of trying to be clean and whatnot, we're not really sure. Now, Buddhism doesn't necessarily have a canon that's held in esteem amongst all believers, but a lot of people, especially followers of Theravada Buddhism, place a lot of emphasis on the Vinaya, which is the monastic code of conduct. As we can see, we have the monks here. Buddhism places a lot of emphasis on monasticism, and even then, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not, because homosexuality is not actually covered in the Vinaya, sexuality in general is prohibited for monks, because their goal is to overcome attachment, right, and desire, including sexual desire, desire for food, desire for money, desire for video games. Any kind of desire is a hindrance to one's enlightenment, which is ultimately what their goal in life is to become enlightened. So there's a lot of debate as to whether or not, even in this context, homosexuality is something that is wrong because it's wrong, or is it wrong simply because it's something that people desire, which would make it, so. Cultural considerations here. We have the Hijras, who in Indian and Hindu society are considered to be a third gender. Most of the time are male to female transgendered individuals. They live on the outside, on the fringes of Hindu society. They are forced into menial labor, into cleaning, and providing entertainment, prostitution, and sex work, and other things like that, because they're essentially outcast. However, there's a dichotomy here, because in Hindu society, Hijras also play an important role because their blessings are considered to be very potent and are sought after, especially for newborn babies and whatnot. But because, again, the conservative nature of Indian society, they are outcast, which is quite sad. And in Buddhism, culturally, very interesting information about how in Japan, Buddhist monks actually very frequently engaged in pederastic homosexuality, which is where they would have a monk who maybe would engage in sexual activity with a novice. Oftentimes these were teenage boys or a little bit younger. And as with the ancient Greeks, this was considered to be very acceptable and something that was celebrated. There's a whole genre of art dealing with male sexual love and desire in Japanese Buddhism in the Middle Ages. It was not seen as something that was abnormal or wrong. It was just something that was seen as a vice that maybe you shouldn't do too much, because, again, it will hinder your ability to attain enlightenment, which is what the ultimate goal is. Finally, contemporary issues. There is a push in India to legalize same-sex marriage. It is not legal there. However, several years ago, the Indian Supreme Court did overturn a colonial-era British law that made homosexual activity illegal. So that was very positive. And there are many Indian activists who are on the front lines of this and who are continuing to fight the good fight and are doing what they need to do in order to be able to try to get positive changes in their society, as well as more recognition in their religious faith. And finally, in Buddhism, there are many organizations, including the Buddhist Churches of America, which is the American arm of Jodo Shinshu, which is essentially a Japanese form of Buddhism with special emphasis on what's called the Pure Land. It is very pro-LGBT, is very pro, consensual sexuality, and it's pro-happiness. So there is there are many organizations, especially in the United States and Canada and whatnot, that are working to spread awareness of Buddhism and its positive views of the LGBT community.